I'm in Atlanta.
Okay, that's good. Chile, you say you're in Lagos.
No, oh, Dr. Obi is here. Oh.
So Dr. Obi is here already. Whoa, yay!
Hi, Dr. Obi. I think we can start by introducing ourselves. Everybody on the panel can just introduce themselves while we're waiting for more participants to join. It's 5 o'clock now, so I'll start with myself. My name is Chinenye Wanaka. I'm a lawyer and the managing partner of the Firma Advisory, law and consulting firm here in Nigeria. And I'm also a co-founder of Africa Policy Conversations, which is the platform that we're on right now. And we curate these conversations both in person and virtually, to talk about trending policy issues that affect everyone on the continent. So over to you, Amara. You can introduce yourself and then all the other panelists before we get to it.
My name is Amara Wampa. I am the director for the Public Policy Initiative at the Yaradua Foundation. I am also a board member of the Africa Policy Conversation and the mentor for the European APAC Forum, the African Network. Next.
Thank you so much, Amara. Next person, everybody can go next.
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicolette Mundabi. You can call me Nikki. It's shorter and simpler. I am an international business professional that's based in Atlanta. I'm also very passionate about social impact. So I currently work with MoneyGram International as the Africa Portfolio Manager. And I just joined the board for Books for Africa, which is a nonprofit based here in the US that is on course to ship its 50th millionth book onto the continent. So yeah, that's basically what's keeping me busy in 2020.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Edward Mabaya. I'm Division Manager for Agribusiness Development at the African Development Bank, based in Abidjan, where I'm part of the Feed Africa team that's working in all 54 member countries to spearhead the agricultural development and food security. It's a pleasure to join this panel.
My name is Obia Zakwesili, and why is Amara laughing? I'm doing.
I like your background. I love your background.
Thank you. Everyone's loved my background since we began COVID era. Yes. So my name is Obia Zakwesili, and I am a Senior Economic Advisor for the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative, and I have been in the work of policy for quite a long time now.
So much, Madam. It's such an honor to have you on our panel.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to being taught.
What's learning from you, Ma? Yeah, so next person, Kimberly, you go next.
I'll go next. Thank you very much for having me today for this conversation. My name is Kimberly Wagidel. I'm the CEO of Future Software Resources Limited, an IT service company based in Lagos. We focus on digital marketing, e-learning, and IT consultancy with a core focus on digital transformation. On the side, in my personal capacity, I also do a lot of work around technology policy. I'm part of the IT policy think tank that has recently reviewed the Nigerian IT policy. I'm also part of the NESG IT systems thematic group. I'm actually the deputy thematic lead. We're currently restructuring that to focus more on the digital economy. So we're very excited to sort of play a role in shaping technology policy in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Last but not the least.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Somkele Awakalu. I work in the Office of the Vice President. I'm a Special Assistant Research and Data Analytics. I'm grateful to be here.
Awesome, awesome. For those that are just joining us, you can see that we have a power-packed panel, and everyone on this panel has so much to offer us. And if you're just joining, at the chat box, you can, state where you're from so that we have an idea of where people are joining us from. I think right now we have about 65 participants, and it keeps increasing. So just let us know where you're joining from. I'm going to hand over to Amara to, give us his introductory remarks, and then introduce our special guest.
Okay. I just want to welcome everyone, all the participants here, to this webinar, which is the start of a conversation on policy proposals for African countries in the COVID-19 era. As we all know, COVID-19 is an existential crisis for Africa. I believe it has severely tested our social, economic, and political resilience in the continent. Interestingly, some of the measures that have been implemented to contain the disease across the world has also trapped our elites in Nigeria. I mean, in Africa. And for the first time, we actually have to be self-reliant. We have to rely on our domestic capacity to cope with the challenges that we're facing. The WHO estimates that between 29 and 44 million Africans could be infected with COVID-19, resulting in up to 190,000 deaths if we don't contain the pandemic quickly in Africa. To add to these ominous threats, the World Economic Forum estimates that the losses to the continent could be as large as $275 billion. There is a real risk that Africa's inequality gap will worsen in the coming years as a result of this pandemic. In a post-COVID world, our leaders in Africa have to rethink many of our prior assumptions about the continent, about our capacity, about our role in the world, and we need to find new balances for our individual and collective behavior. The critical policy conversations that will inspire this transformation must start now, and they must include Africa's young and capable technocrats, both at home and in the diaspora. Today's webinar will explore innovative policy recommendations for Africa to cope with the aftermath of COVID-19. The discussions will explore proposals around regional integration, increased digitalization, economic diversification, food security, and of course, foreign policy. I hope that today's session will spur meaningful and productive conversations leading to an effective continental response to the impacts of this pandemic. Africa Policy Conversations is a platform designed to help find fitting solutions to problems that affect economic growth and development across Africa. We are on a mission to improve the standard of living through effective policy development, one conversation at a time. And our focus is actually on young Africans from across the globe who are interested in Africa and looking to impact the policy environment in Africa. It's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. She's familiar to every one of us here because she's been in the policy space as an expert and a heavyweight for decades. Dr. Obieze Kwesili is an economic and human capital expert. She is a senior economic advisor for the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative. It's a platform that advises several African heads of state. So she isn't she's an experienced resource in advising African countries and indeed countries around the world on economic policy. It's a pleasure to have her here with us, and she's going to be giving us a keynote address. Thank you. You're welcome, Ma.
Thank you so very much, Amara, and thank you to the cast of stars that you have lined up for the panel discussion. I just hope that my schedule would enable me to get a little bit of the panelist conversation before I have to run into yet another meeting. I think that many of us, our lives have become even more complicated than it was, when we just had to simply get on the plane and go to various meetings abroad and on the continent, on the continent and outside of the continent. Now people assume that there is so much time, and so they really kill you with so many more work and demands. I think that the fact that you set up this platform is really worthy of applaud, because I have always desired to see many more of young African professionals be interested in the world of policy. I remember when I was still part of the Kennedy School, and I was a keynote speaker at the business school. I normally say that at the Kennedy School, we constantly pray for the souls of the ones who go to business school as a way of, generating laughter amongst them. So I went there to speak to them, and I said to them with so much enthusiasm, as you know I would have, I said, oh boy, I want many of you as you graduate, that so many more of you should begin to think of life in public sector. Go to the public sector and do really life-changing work. And the whole hall just went quiet on me. I mean, if you could have dropped and you would hear it loudly. It was like, what is this woman talking about? Go home to do what? After this expensive MBA program that I have received, she wants me to go and kill myself in the public sector. Sorry, we're not going. So when I now see many more of you beginning to think that the public sector is actually something to give more than a fleeting, attention to, it makes me very, very happy. So I want to say, please stay with this platform. Don't let it be a fad of the moment for you. Let it become an institution well worthy of its mission. And you can always call on me at any time to support you in any way that is possible. Having put that aside, our topic today is something around, preparing Africa for the post-COVID era. Basically, what kind of policy prescriptions would you be looking to see emerge from our continent, even at the moment, not just waiting, because we don't know when the post-COVID era will come. There is a lot of uncertainty yet as to how quickly we can say we've put C-19 behind us. And so when scientists are talking, they go from all kinds of number of months to years. The worst that I have heard are people who say that COVID would not be out of our conversation, out of our public health issue until the next 4-5 years. Now, goodness me, that is really something to worry about. The ones who are more optimistic are saying that toward the end of 2021, we should be able to put the things about COVID, at least the health issues, within manageable control. And it would just be one of those kinds of viruses that we begin to know how to live our lives to avoid their spread. That being said, it means that for us as a people, we must start now. But for us to start now, it would be important for us to even take a step back and say, where were we before C-19 arrived on the scene? Well, I would say that it's important to, I always like to enter these conversations with at least, a data point that people can quickly relate to. And that's, what was Africa doing over the last decade and then by last year in terms of economic growth, right? So economic growth over a period of about a decade on our continent averaged anything between the higher 4% to getting close to 6% for almost a decade. And these were the searing years of Africa rising, because it was a turning of the corner for the continent to begin to grow at levels of growth beyond its population growth rate of an average of 3%. So that was significant. That was what happened, at least up until the global financial economic crisis of the 2008-2009. And that dipped Africa's growth to below the 3% level. And it then began to inch itself back as that era ended, began to seem to end, and it started crawling out of it. And by last year, the continent posted a growth of about 2.8, 2.9%. Well, the thing is, Africa was now on the path of slow growth, even though we had, top grower countries that you could talk about the Ethiopias, the Rwandas, and the Ghanas, and then Cote d'Ivoire, and a couple of other countries like that were growing at anything between 6, 7, and 8%. But the rest were slow growers, or what do you call these kinds of yo-yo growers? Grow high today and then bust tomorrow, and often it was countries like ours, Nigeria, could be put in that basket, and growth was essentially tied to the performance of a commodity. And because 2/3 of African countries have one commodity or the other that is the central factor that determines public budget, and sometimes explain or account for more than 90% of export earnings. It therefore makes such commodity-dependent economies very sensitive to the economic shocks of commodity boom and bust. And so that cycle has often determined the growth of a particular, some 1/3, there's some 2/3 bunch of the continent. Now, the non-oil growth countries have often been steadier in their performance, and we would come to some of the reasons that is the case. So Africa at 2.9% was now back to slow growth. It did not need to go any direction other than up. So for it to go from that 2.9 to IMF's current estimate that Africa's growth in 2020 would be negative 5.2%, that is such a blow for the continent. The reason that this is a major blow for the continent is that growth is tied to poverty reduction. And because poverty reduction is a tough thing to achieve, because not all growth necessarily lead to poverty reduction. So growth is an essential, is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. And so it then worsens when you don't even have growth at all, when growth collapses on you. So this is where we are. We are in a place where we have done this journey of growth up, down, and down now in a more level way, because the World Bank estimates that this is going to be Africa's worst recession since 25 years, and that's so that this is quite important fact to bear in our mind as policy makers. Now, back to this issue of poverty. The estimate was basically that Africa would, Africa was going to still be the region with 70% of the world's global extremely poor people. And that by 2030, Africa would account for about more than almost 500 million of Africans that are still caught in extreme poverty. That's huge. That's really huge. So you can say that Africa's problem, key problem, is that it's a poor continent. No matter the kind of growth that we have so far talked about in the period of Africa Rising, the kind of dismal poverty that we see on our continent should worry any policymaker. This is the headline issue. But now the headline issue is doubly accentuated by the fact that the C-19 impact is being estimated as something that would lead to some 40 to 60 million newly poor people being added to the global number. Now, the thing is, of these 40 to 60 million addition to poor people, extremely poor people in the world, Africa would be 23 million of that. So it is a worsening state of poverty that we are faced with. Now, if we understand that poverty is a destabilization driver, then it means that we have a continent that continues to be a potential point of destabilization because of the depth of the acute poverty and the tension that results from high inequality between a very extremely small and negligible upper percentile of people whose wealth, account for more than 80% of the continent's wealth. Now, with that in mind, it means that for the policymaker, it is, what was it that stopped Africa from being able to tackle poverty in the way that it could have tackled poverty in all these decades of its development journey? Africa, and many African countries, as a matter of fact, had higher GDP per capita than China as early as the 70s and the 80s. And so what accounted for China being able to quickly get its act together and move in the direction of economic growth in an assured pattern of sustained growth, high growth, to be able to tackle poverty, lift 800 million people out of poverty in less than 4 decades? Why did we fail in this regard? What are the key issues that the policymaker needs to bear in mind? Because diagnostics that enable us understand what our failures were would be what we need in order to give us a basis for an analytically anchored pathway to a new Africa. The new Africa that I want to see is an Africa that does not begin to moan about the challenges that the post-COVID era presents to it, but an Africa that says, perhaps these challenges are a blessing in disguise, and it is now time to chart a different pathway compared to the way we approached the development process in the past. And so the number one thing that was, I have 6 things that I say where I consider critical manifestations of Africa's failure in the past. So I said poverty, joblessness, and inequality as one bucket. And I have spoken a lot about poverty. But poverty just doesn't happen. People don't just are poor. People are poor because something else is happening. That something else that happens is that people are poor because they don't have income. People don't have income because they don't have jobs, they don't have trade, they don't have any economic activity that enables them to earn income. Or people have jobs, or they have one thing that they do, but they don't earn sufficient income to take them above the poverty threshold. And so what is that thing that is holding them back? It is low productivity. So Africans are poor because many Africans operate at low productivity basis. And so this matter of joblessness, and then of course the inequality that comes from low income and the few that have really top percentile high income, it is a major failure for our continent. The second bucket for me, the food insecurity and climate change. Food insecurity and climate change. What is it that a continent, which today still accounts for more than 65% of the world's remaining arable land, according to the FAO, suffers sporadic famine, goes through situations of food insecurity to the level where nutrition is a problem for Africa's children. That is a failure of immense proportion. Agriculture and agribusiness could have been what would have enabled Africa's pathway toward production systems, but it did not happen. That's a major failure. The third bucket of failure for me, human development. Human development, the delivery of basic services of low services in education, in health, in water and sanitation, human development. When you think of the fact that majority of Africa's population that are poor correlates to those that lack access to basic services, you can then see how important the matter of health and education are to tackling Africa's pernicious poverty. When you also look at a piece of data from UNESCO, 1/5 of children between the ages of 6 and 11 are out of school on our continent, followed by 1/3 of youth between the ages of 12 and 14. And according to a UIS data, almost 60% of youth between the ages of 15 and 17 are not in school. Access to health, water, sanitation are dimmer. And we have seen in the post-COVID, in the COVID-19 era, how the matter of poor health system has been a factor in the resilience to the pandemic. Our health system is the weakest in the assessment of health systems around the globe. According to UNICEF, despite global progress that was made in reducing the child mortality over many decades now, an estimated 5.4 million children under the age of 5 died in 2017. Guess what? Roughly half of that number on our continent. So that's failure. That's failure. 2/3 of the continent experience extreme heat and highly variable rainfall during much of the year, showing the climatic dimension of the health and human development issues that I was talking about. Then the fourth bucket, energy poverty and deficit of infrastructure, that is critical infrastructure. Only 1 out of every 3 Africans has access to electricity, without which you can't break out of poverty. Small businesses in Africa that are in the informal sector represent the largest contributors to jobs. Jobs on the continent, not created by corporate businesses. And there's an informality of economic activity that is associated with our continent. And all of these have to do with a number of the number of the 4 things that I already highlighted. And then of course the low productivity and lack of economic diversification. So we are a continent where our factor productivity is so low. Because of this low factor productivity, when you look at us, we are at the lowest spot of the value chain in global manufacturing and services. And it is the same risk that we actually are facing when it comes to the adoption of ICT and technology more broadly. And then the 6th bucket, financing for development. Well, the SDGs are estimated to require an incremental outlay of about 200 billion to even 1.2 trillion. Financing this for us is going to be, you don't want to say impossible, but you want to say this is going to be the biggest challenge ever for us. Because when you look at country budgets, many of them don't reflect what their presidents went to sign as part of the SDGs. And yet, when you look at the SDGs in their formulation, they are a country that does not have any capacity can actually take the SDG format and use it as a basis to do its budgeting. And if it is sensible with the right kinds of policy makers, it can actually come out with good prioritization. But if it comes out with good prioritization, they must be invested into. And that investment is only possible to the extent of you having the investable capital. Now, Africa is a continent that trails all the other continents in terms of tax to GDP. Our tax to GDP is something of about 15.1%. I think the global average is something of about 26%. So this is a major issue. Now, a key matter that brings all of these things together there are really two things. The two critical things that I see that bring all these things together. The quality of macroeconomic policies and structural policies on our continent, on the one hand, and then the capacity for execution in terms of public sector execution on the other hand, but underpinned by the matter of what economic philosophy does our continent embrace? What would we say is the economic philosophy of our continent? So I move on to the fact that there are, in thinking of post-COVID era, we must first say to ourselves as Africans, what do we believe in terms of economic philosophy? Do we, for me, I would venture that this matter of ideologues pitting one group against the other, because some are saying, oh, we're socialists, and others are saying we're capitalists and all of that. That is totally not what Africa should concern itself with. What Africa should concern itself with is what economic philosophy do we subscribe to in terms of what is it that would drive the vision that we express in what we want to do differently to lift our people out of poverty and create a prosperous continent. And I would say that two things are the pillar of my economic philosophy for our continent: high productivity and strong competitiveness. High productivity and strong competitiveness. If anything that we do would give us high productivity, it doesn't matter to me what name you call that thing. It doesn't matter to me what ideology you call that thing. If what you're going to do that would give us high ranks in terms of competitiveness, in terms of being an environment that are not, that investments are not skittish to, I don't care what you label it, I would go for it. What I just want is for our continent to embrace high productivity and competitiveness as the pillars of everything that we're going to walk through in order to get us out of the throes of poverty and the struggles that go with it. So what would my memo to a policy, to a political leader look like? And I'm giving you insight to some of the things that I'm doing with my life these days, in continuation with the kind of work that I do as a policy expert, advising leaders of countries. So number one thing is that I am saying, hey, health is economy. We now know it. If you didn't know it before, the health sector is economy, stupid. That really says a lot, because in the past, the health sector and the education sector were often looked at as being outside of the economy. And African heads of state would behave as if the health sector and the education sector are the business of donors. They did not put the kind of level of priority to these two sectors that determine the quality of human capital that the continent would have. The quality of human development, the average human development score of the continent is still hovering around 4 out of a possible 10 in the UNDP measurement of Global Human Development Index. Now, that cannot work again. We must see that health is wealth, health is economy, and therefore investing in the short, medium to long term in resilient health system is a priority. The health system must get priority, not just in terms of the amount of money that's thrown into it, but in terms of real investment into it, meaning investment that yields results. So result-based health financing is a key innovation that has been waiting for many African countries to take hold of. So a country like Rwanda has used result-based health financing as a way to improve the resilience of its health system. It can withstand shock, because when this kind of a shock happens, it no longer is about health. It becomes also about livelihood. So life and livelihood can be contained because you have well invested in the health systems and made them resilient. The education system is so important for us to make a priority as we go forward. Not in terms of let's sink more money to education, because Amara and a few of you have heard me say that if you make education, if you make the problem in education a money problem, you make a big mistake. You have a dysfunction in education across our continent. If you put more money into a dysfunction, you don't get results. What you get is a well-funded dysfunctionality. So you can't afford that. Every money wasted in health and education is a huge opportunity cost to the several children who died and the women who died as a result of poor health systems, or even any other human being who could die during this COVID situation, or a huge opportunity cost to children who are out of school. So it is important that we should look at health and education as priority that is top for government to put the most important of its energy toward. The next thing is we must understand that health now has shown us how powerfully we can collaborate. If you see what has happened in the COVID era, the public-private partnership happened in a natural kind of way. People felt worried enough about death and the ominous possibilities of it, that the private sector didn't need to be given a beat on the head for it to stagger out and to say, we can be a part of this solution. Well, if there's something that's important for us to do, it's to learn how this partnership has happened. Even the civil society and the communities have been part of the partnership. The civil society has not made as much noise of how much it has weighed in to help cushion the effect of COVID on the communities and families. But it is important for there to be a study by policymakers on our continent in order to build a very, very well-designed structure of collaboration and partnership in solving our problems on the continent between public sector, private sector, and the citizens. The third point that I wish to make is that this is the season when we should take the Africa Free Trade Agreement even more seriously. It was supposed to go into force in July. I think that they have already postponed it because of COVID. I would have said that a counterintuitive approach would have been to still go ahead with getting this off the ground, because you cannot wait indefinitely for the COVID era to end for you to get this important an instrument activated. The reason that I say this is the global trade, Africa is 2% of it. Global trade is going to be in trouble. Africa's 12 to 14% Africa trading with Africa, that is in continental trade, is so low compared to 70% in Europe, some 50 or 55% in the North Americas, some 65% or thereabout in Asia. So we are so low. Now that we see that the world is going to be rediscussing the matter of trade and who they trade with, this is the time where our free trade instrument should really kickstart itself, because we're going to need each country to generate a lot of foreign exchange in order to tide our manufacturing sector. And the way around this is to make sure that we're not delaying the commencement of the free trade agreement. In fact, one of the data that I saw and found very interesting is that if Africa increased its contribution to global trade by just 1% from 2%, we stand the possibility of generating more than $70 billion additionally annually. We could do with such a flow into the continent. We could. Now, the fourth thing is the fiscal crisis. The fiscal crisis on the continent, because of, as we say, low resource mobilization capabilities, it means that we're going to be struggling. You know that already states in Nigeria, if the governors are not already thinking about it, some of them might actually be thinking of asking somebody else to become governor of their state while they take a little bit of leave, because you can suffer the kind of huge revenue shock that they are going to face and have no recipe to, or no kind of solution for how to get out of it. And so fiscal crisis is going to be huge and a problem. And then when you think in terms of monetary policy is going to be struggling. In order to be non-accommodating, it would still be figuring out how to support the fiscal measures. And in the process of doing that, central banks can make all kinds of silly mistakes. The worst mistake that they can make is the mistake that takes inflation to double digits and higher double digits, because that's going to make the environment not interesting for private investment. And that's going to worsen poverty and affect the poor, because it's a quick pass through. The poor have no asset holding. The poor live every day to eat, to wear their clothing, to have a roof over their heads. And so they have no asset classification that they can migrate to. Inflation deals with them badly. So the monetary policies must not be monetary policies that lead to the kind of inflationary trend that our continent was associated with in the past. Let me quickly just highlight the other two things, and then I would give room to questions. The unsustainable debt situation on the continent is a crisis point problem. And so discussions on what to do with the debt must be discussions that are not muffled. I'm not hearing the voice of the continent well enough in terms of how they are going to become responsible borrowers. It's a thing of great pain for someone like me. Together with our team at the bank, we helped to lead to the HIPIC decision point and a completion point, and therefore HIPIC debt reduction of several countries on the continent. The same countries right before my eyes have taken themselves to unsustainable debt levels in less than a decade. How is that even defensible? And so there is a big problem, but you know that I have an entirely different issue as far as it concerns how China, failed to be responsible in the way it handled COVID-19, and therefore the impact that it has had on the continent, and what must be a payable liability for taking down the continent's growth. That's an entirely different bucket of policy measure that I put on the table. But in terms of the broader issue of debt, our leaders have been reckless. They have been irresponsible in the way that they have gone a borrowing, especially with non-concessional debts that they have stacked up. And now we're faced with constrained fiscal environment. What are we going to do? It's something that requires policymakers sitting across the table, really crunching the numbers and determining how we're going to redesign debt sustainability management, debt management systems and institutions, as well as policies. And the other points are manufacturing and export, because they are tied to the diversification agenda. Without export, export earnings, it's going to be hard for the continent. So we can see that, you know, a lot of domestic the domestic constituencies of donors will be hostile to any augmentation in aid, because they're going to say we also are in trouble. And so they wouldn't have, leaders are not going to have the political mandate to augment aid in the kind of way that Africa may be thinking. And perhaps that's a good thing for the continent to wisen up to the fact that we have to make sure that some critical policies that attract investment, we need to solve more problems through the private sector. The private sector has to be truly the engine of growth for us. And that means that we need to have a manufacturing and export strategy. So I'm saying that the continent's industrialization policy needs to be at the top of the agenda of all our political leaders, continent-wise. And a thing that I add to that is, could you imagine a continent that does not wait for the World Bank doing business ranking, but a continent that says that it is going to innovate its own competition amongst the countries, for which country would have the friendliest business environment as a competition to move them toward this direction of industrial policy era, where government plays the role that it must play and the private sector just responds because it sees that the critical environment within which it can do low-cost businesses is now available. And then I have highlights on technology. I'm saying that STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, we need to put them at the center of our conversation. We are seeing innovation by Africa's young people. Why are we sleeping on our young people? Our young people feel frustrated because they feel like they are not understood by the policymakers. We need to use the COVID era, where the people that did not understand our young people are now all migrating online because there is no other way that they can keep up with life. They just must do technology. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the continent. ICT is the only revolution we could say that we have really been at the heart of it, because we saw mobile telephony move from 20 million fixed telephone lines on our continent to over 500 million mobile telephones on our continent. And mobile telephone is not for talking on our continent. It is a solution to multiple problems. And so how do we move from that to where we now need to be, where technology and its absorption is more rapid, and we ensure that the rural community are integrated into these solutions. And I think my two final points are, don't forget the young people. Don't even make women marginal to the next part of growth. Women have to be at the center of this growth. Women are Africa's hidden secret, or what do you call it? The most visible secret weapon. That's how I describe them. They are Africa's most visible secret weapon for economic development. We cannot make this conversation around women as though it were some, drinking, what do you call it, after party conversation. No, it's at the center of the way that we are optimizing our use of our human resources. And so bring women into the center of the conversation in the way that they participate in economic activities, in political representation, in family, household, community level issues. And my final point is citizens have the responsibility to design post-COVID Africa. You see, African citizens, the state of Africa is a shame to us. It's not to the so-called leaders. It's a shame to the citizens on this continent that they are not tired of being at the bottom of everything. The citizens will design the pathway, and they would make sure that in designing that pathway, they are simply saying that all of the kinds of thoughts that you're going to be discussing today is going to depend on the quality of governance. Now, the quality of governance is dependent on the quality of your political system, your political incentives, your political institutions, your political landscape, your political actors. And who can determine that quality? It is ultimately citizens. Citizens have a duty to fix politics on our continent in order that good governance will attain the very important role that it plays in coordinating all of what I have said. So thank you very much for the opportunity of addressing you.
Wow, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Obi Ezekasili. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. A lot of the comments coming in, someone here, Ahastro Kolade says, I love that word, ma. I am a man, but yes, women are very pivotal in the success of every nation. Women, citizens, everybody's hands must be on deck. So at this point, I'm going to let other panelists comments, add some points to what you've just said before we go into the Q&A. It's Africa Policy Conversation, so it's going to be a conversation, and we want the audience to be able to participate in this as well. But thank you so much, Ma.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll start with the first panelist. We'll start with Mr. Edward Mabaya from the African Development Bank. And you have a background in agriculture, and everyone says that agriculture is one of the sectors that will help us diversifying the economy in Africa. We have to be self-sufficient. We need to, depend less on imports. So what would be your policy recommendation for African countries to look into investing in agriculture, and how can they attract, finance in that sector as well?
Thank you very much, Chinenye, and Dr. Obi, thank you for those passionate remarks. I must say, first of all, I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. First of all, to see young, bright African minds, and also to see a mostly female panel, it's very refreshing to me. I'm tired of sitting on panels that are consisting of all white old men. So it's time that we've taken on this conversation and addressing these challenges. So congratulations to the organizers for putting together such an excellent panel. I'll be speaking more from an agricultural perspective, partly because my job at the African Development Bank, I'm the division manager for agribusiness development. But secondly, because I think and I realize agriculture is vital to the growth and development of the African continent, as already been highlighted by our keynote speaker. We know that agriculture employs upwards of 60% of the African economy. We know that food and livelihoods are dependent on the agricultural sector. So it's quite important that we start by painting the picture of what is the current state of the agricultural sector in Africa before we even move forward. Yes, there's new challenges that are being presented by COVID, but if we went back to December of 2019, or even January, there's a picture there that is very disturbing about Africa's agriculture. And we will not be honest with ourselves if we do not think about that and address it first. So first, African agriculture is being hit by several disasters from multiple angles. You've followed the news. In the Horn of Africa, there's a locust invasion that's devastating yields. There's been massive climate change that's causing droughts and floods across the continent. And the result of all this is that there's very low agricultural productivity across the African continent. Smallholder farmers get less than a third of the yield that other farmers are able to get around the world, in some cases even less than a quarter. So it's already been highlighted by our speaker, we have to start by fixing the agricultural sector. We have to increase the productivity. As a result of this poor performance, right now Africa has been importing $47 billion worth of food a year. As was highlighted in motivating this talk, this problem of COVID may cost Africa $37 billion. We are throwing away $47 billion worth of money to bring in food into a continent that could otherwise be self-reliant. In fact, this continent should be exporting food to the rest of the world. So by exporting this, we're exporting jobs, we're exporting livelihoods, and we're buying a lot of finished processed goods into Africa. The African continent right now has about 257 million hungry people a year. This is before COVID. These are numbers that are pre-COVID. This should worry all of us. So we have all these dire statistics about agriculture and food security in Africa. I could go on and on, but they're known to most of us here. I'm preaching to the choir. So what does COVID do to this situation? I'd like to say it's like when you pour salt on an open wound. This wound was already bleeding and you put salt on it, it's gonna hurt. Yes, COVID has put a new twist to this food insecurity challenge in Africa. First of all, in an attempt to address the health pandemic, we've closed borders, we've restricted movement of people. While all these good measures are good for containing the pandemic, they can have devastating blows on the agricultural sector. We cannot move agricultural inputs, seed and fertilizer, to the farmers where they need it the most. People who live in urban areas are having food shortages because food cannot move from some rural areas or excess production into the urban areas where they need it the most. So we now have this situation where an already bad situation is being made worse by the COVID pandemic. So you add to that global food imports, all these countries that we've been importing grain from, guess what? They're saying we need to find out that we can feed our own people first before we can export these grains to other parts of the world. So to me, this puts us into the next phase. How do we get from these problems to the solution? We need a recovery plan for Africa, yes, indeed. As somebody has once said, and this is becoming a very often quoted side these days, that we can turn this crisis into an opportunity. Do not let a crisis go to waste. This is a wake-up moment for our leadership. And we need to be investing more in the agricultural sector. We at the African Development Bank have had a facility called the COVID Response Facility, where we're investing $10 billion to help African governments to mitigate the effects of the COVID pandemic. Within that, we have a very specific effort that's geared towards addressing the challenges of food and nutritional insecurity. I must say, not to be boring here, the solutions are not new. What agriculture needs, the formula and the recipe is still the same old thing. One, we need to increase productivity. This means our small rural farmers need to be equipped with the latest technologies in seed, fertilizer, machinery, mechanization to make them produce more on the same unit of land. That's point number one. Point number two, we need to capture more of what we produce. That means reducing post-harvest loss and adding value to what it is that we're already producing. We need to be doing more to go from primary production to actually adding value to what we're processing, and that's what we need in Africa. Third, we need to increase investment in infrastructure. This means that water, energy, roads, these things that enable the sector of agriculture, and I must add there, information, communication technology, or digital agriculture must be a key priority, because we see in a moment where people cannot move from one region to another, e-agriculture is going to be the next frontier. No longer can extension officers go to the rural areas, but online using a cell phone, farmers can get that information. We also need to increase our enabling environment for agriculture. That's already been highlighted by the speaker. If you look at the ease of doing business, you realize where African countries lie at the bottom of that hierarchy. To attract these investment flows, we need to be able to harness all these resources from private sector and bring them to the service of agriculture. Last but not least, we realize that this revolution needs to be financed. We at the African Development Bank right now, we are in the middle of creating an investment plan that will unlock some of our investments from various agricultural projects and really earmark them towards the response for the COVID pandemic. We are developing restructuring projects and allowing African governments to have a more coordinated response that is going to be investing in agricultural inputs, investing in post-harvest loss, increasing extension service, and enabling digital facilities. All this to make sure that our continent can be more self-reliant and more self-sufficient in supplying food to his citizens. I'll leave it at that, and I'll come back to with more comments a little bit later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what struck me was that the fact that African countries are actually supposed to export to the world, yet we're the ones importing. We're so import dependent. And I hope that this COVID opportunity will allow us to really develop the agriculture sector in Nigeria so that we can feed ourselves and also export to the rest of the world. I think on that note, I'm going to move over to Nkemdiling. Everybody has been talking about the digital economy. I think before COVID-19, tech was big, but now like everyone is like, tech companies are in business. Everybody's doing everything online. Zoom has made so much money because everyone is having their meetings virtually, webinars, and so on and so forth. In Nigeria, we have, a tech industry that's growing. What do you think, the government of Nigeria and other African countries can do to boost this growth in the tech ecosystem? What kind of policies can be put in place to support businesses, in the technology sector? So because at the end of the day, we can't keep using all these tools that are, given to us. We need to make sure that we're also utilizing the homegrown solutions, innovative solutions, in Nigeria and in Africa as well. So what's your take on that?
All right. Thank you, Chinenye, so much for that question. So I think that we need to sort of approach technology from more of a national strategy or continental strategy view as opposed to as a sector, right? I always feel that whether it is in education or when we come to the economy, technology is like that thing on the side, right? Instead of the driver. And I think that we really need to figure out how do we make technology the center and the core of our economic strategies across the continent, right? How does technology become that foundation that we lay for all sectors? Ed talked about, digital agriculture, and digital, is a driver. It's a tool that you can sort of integrate into any sector, and whether it is education, whether it is healthcare, and I really love the comments Dr. Obi made about technology being a key success factor to our economic growth and development, and I strongly believe in the same. And I think that there are a couple of key things that we need to ensure in order to actually be able to partake in the fourth industrial revolution and truly build a digital economy. And these things are, figuring out our issues around access and connectivity, right? We have major issues. We have a broadband plan in Nigeria, for example, and there are major issues in terms of how do we actually expand our broadband infrastructure. The issues are around right-of-way charges, double taxation, and things like that. Ekiti State has just, sort of slashed the right-of-way charges from over 4,000 naira to 145 naira, and that is a huge step. This is something that we need to do on a national level in order to accelerate the way that we actually build our technology so that the private sector can actually invest in the infrastructure. Ed mentioned different types of infrastructure, and the one part of infrastructure that was missing for me was broadband and technology infrastructure, and actually ensuring that we complete that last mile, right? And that we create public-private partnerships, that also don't necessarily have to tax at the beginning, right? Why can't it be an ongoing partnership where as people use the infrastructure, government gets paid? Government would get paid much more if they did that type of model than, oh, come on, pay this right now, because that limits the amount of money that companies can actually spend on building this infrastructure. So we have to support infrastructure development for technology, right? Another thing that I think we really need to do is to figure out how do we actually create policies around patronage of locally made technology, right? So when you were talking, you said, technology companies are booming, and Zoom made so much money. Zoom is an American company. We're putting money in that American company's pocket every single day. This webinar is putting money into Zoom's pocket, right? Why can we not build locally made solutions? And this has to be supported. In the US, when you look at the development and sort of upcoming of Silicon Valley, it is government that was the cornerstone of that. Government and the military, right? They are the key clients of technology. And this is a trend that you will see in many global economies where government is the cornerstone in terms of patronage. So we must ensure that there's patronage. Small technology businesses, if they could get a contract, to build some type of portal, and they know that I'm going to have a support contract for the next 10 years, and this money is guaranteed, then I can scale my business. Then I can make sure that I actually employ more people, train more people, and get more people in, right? So patronage is a really, really key aspect of actually driving technology and developing the technology sector. Another aspect that I've just sort of, skirted on is people, right? And Dr. Obi mentioned that as well. She said we have to invest in STEM education. We have to ensure that our people can actually participate, right? You can create all the infrastructure, you can create all the companies you like, but if there are no people who can actually develop technology, if there are no people that can actually maintain the technology, we're going to continue to be consumers and not creators. And what we're seeing now with this, pandemic and borders being closed, a lot of big companies in Nigeria, for example, are currently having IT freezes simply because they cannot fly in their foreign IT support partners. This is a huge opportunity for Nigerian companies to actually step up. But the problem is that we do not have the human capital to actually do this work, which means that we have to heavily invest into training and heavily invest into human capital development. And that has to be at the core of any policy that we sort of develop and think about for a post-COVID world. I also think that we really need to think about how, what policies are we going to adapt as governments? For example, there are different government institutions that are currently down, like the CAC in Nigeria. And this means that for weeks now, applications have been hanging. But this is not just applications have been hanging, it is revenue loss. And we really need to look at how can we ensure government services are available online to ensure that we mitigate against revenue loss that the government is currently experiencing. And we have to make sure as a nation that our citizens are also enabled with the right digital skills in order to actually access these digital services. So e-government has to be at the center of whatever we do and how we move forward. I also think that we need to become more transparent with the way that we spend, and the way that we transact, and figure out how technology can help that. And the last thing I would say is that we have to also figure out how do we fund all of this, right? All of these things I've talked about are, very nice, fluffy, and, things that make people smile. But at the end of the day, if there is no money to actually fund this, what happens, right? We have to figure out policies around incentivizing local investors and making sure that, there are public-private partnerships that can actually help build this talent, build the infrastructure, integrate e-government, and ensure that we have this digital transparency that I'm talking about. If we do not have that partnership, and I think that this pandemic actually has shown how powerful public-private partnerships can be and the role that the private sector should be playing, right? And I think that government really needs to rethink their own sort of business model and really think about how can we use technology as that strategic tool that will take us to that next level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Thank you for talking to us about the technology sector. I don't know if you all have noticed, my light keeps going on and off, and that's one of the challenges that we're facing in Africa, especially in Nigeria, infrastructure challenges, and government has to do more. Government has to do more to support these sectors, especially IT. You need more public-private partnership. She talks about Silicon Valley. There are laws in the US that actually incentivize people to invest in tech companies. So if you invest in a tech startup, you can get tax exemption. There are things that are are there to encourage people to invest in their local economies. So on that note, I'm going to move over to Somkele, since we're talking about government. What is the role of government in all this? And also in Nigeria and in Africa, we have so many beautiful policies, but implementation remains an issue. How can we get to a stage where we are able to successfully implement all these beautiful policies that we have in writing?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to co-panelists and keynote speaker who have gone before me. Being the only one who is in public sector, I know that there's going to be a lot of eyes of what can government do, which is very valid. But I'll start by saying that sometimes good policy can only emerge where there's high quality data. So I think that right now we're at a point, COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to reset and prioritize critical sectors. So there are sectors that, according to the ERGP in Nigeria, that's the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, that were critical to our recovery from the 2016 recession. COVID-19 has given us a different perspective where we're saying, okay, how can we use our comparative advantage, whether it be in terms of solid minerals, whether it be in terms of our huge population. So those are the things that we need to critically assess now. I think also an important point that Dr. Ezekwesili made was citizens. I think that in Nigeria, it is important that the citizens of Nigeria give back as well. I think that the government needs to put in place infrastructure. They need to create an enabling environment that makes the economy competitive. So I'll go into that, but I think I wanted to start from citizens first. I think that there's a lot of constructive criticism that's out there about what the government can do, what can be done better in certain areas. But I feel like sometimes some people are not engaging in policy discussions for good. It's more like a blame game. The government is not doing this. However, there are a number of things that the government is doing that implementation comes down to the citizens. For instance, if you look at the Executive Order 5 that the president signed, which has to do with promoting local content and encouraging made in Nigeria industries, the enabling policy, the enabling law is there. It's now down to patronage and people taking this opportunity and saying, okay, you know what, the government has put down this policy, this executive order, and we can key into it. So I think that part of what the government needs to do, or part of what the government is doing, is critically reassessing the priorities, trying to make more data-based decision making. So for instance, the benchmark for oil prices was revised downwards to $30 per barrel from $57 per barrel. Now that's been further revised to $25 per barrel, pending National Assembly accession, obviously. That kind of decision making is very important because it means that you're considering all the facts on ground and then making policies based on that. So I'm a special assistant on research and data analytics. I think creating that kind of role was important in the office of vice president, for instance, because it's important that policies are based on data. I think it's important for us to say, okay, if we're looking at the sector now, for instance, and we're saying IT is a critical player, that needs to be supported by data. I'm not saying that IT is not important. I'm basically saying that we need to identify data. So as soon as Dr. Ezekwesili came on, she reeled out data about possible revenue losses, about more people falling into poverty. Those kind of data will enable us make better decisions. So I'm not going to, there's some things that the government is doing as well. They're creating 704,000 jobs. So that's 1,000 jobs per local government in Nigeria across various sectors. And also, I know that Dr. Ezekwesili, I dare not contradict what she's saying, but I think that if we're looking at the enabling business environment, for instance, improving the competitiveness of the economy was a critical pillar of the Nigerian government. So if we can create an enabling environment for businesses to thrive, not the not the big corporates alone, but I'm talking about the micro, the small, the medium enterprises. So for instance, if we look at all the work that has been done by the CAC in enabling starting a business to be easier. It used to take aeons for a person to get a business name, let alone start a business. Those kind of policies will enable Nigeria go forward. So I think that, just to round up, I think that the government is doing, prior to COVID, had attempted to tackle some of these issues that are glaring. However, COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to reset and to take into consideration a lot more things that were not apparent prior to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sumkele. So we've talked about Nigeria and we've talked about the government, but then what is the role of the private sector? Our next panelist is from DRC Congo, and she lives in the US, and she's done work with various businesses from different parts of Africa. So I want you, Nicolette, to give us the point of view from the private sector. What do businesses in Africa need to do? Because we've talked about the fact that it's not just government. You know, we need to be the change we want to see. There has to be that collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. So speak to the businesses, because I know that there are people who have logged on who are business owners, you know, who want to be able to export their services, not only within Africa, because we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but also export their products and services across the world, because the world has become a global village. So what do these businesses have to have in mind, African businesses? And then you can also tell us some examples from DRC Congo as well, because this is a Pan-African panel. We have about, I think, 100 and something participants, ranging from 130 to, so there's quite a bit of us here. So we want to hear from you about the African perspective.
Thank you, Chine, for that question. And thank you for all the panelists that have gone before me, as well as Dr. Obi. It was intriguing to hear you listen. I definitely learned a lot. So definitely thank you for that. Looking at business all over the continent, I actually did my MBA dissertation on the internationalization of SMEs in Nigeria, because I was doing business in Nigeria before. And my point of focus was like, okay, we need to grow more businesses, obviously. We want them to be competitive. We want them to be competitive globally. And so looking at the process of internationalization and the policies that we need to help businesses grow. Local businesses right now, I think Jack Ma said it best, this is a year for surviving. I don't think at the moment that we're going to be looking to thrive under these conditions, but I think if businesses can just hold steady and find ways to just get through the year first, let us become a little bit more resilient as it relates to the current economic climate and obviously the issues that it's going to create. I know that with the money transfer business, remittance business here in MoneyGram, we are projected to lose about 20% of our business this year. And a lot of that was actually funds going into the continent, helping other people either with their businesses, with their households, etc. So I think what businesses need to do at the moment is just focus on how do we make it through this moment. I also agree with Dr. Obi on the African Continental Trade Agreement, on it being implemented sooner rather than later, because a lot of our survival is actually going to depend on our ability to do business with one another in terms of, you know, on a national level as well. For instance, let's with the COVID cure that the President Rajolina is actually pushing right now for Madagascar. If we're able to actually help, like for instance, I feel like there's the cure, but then we don't have the data behind it. Just like some Kelly said, we need data to be able to move forward with certain things. And so for that product, it'd be great if there was a company somewhere else on the continent that could maybe provide the clinical trials, that can help hold the control groups, so that we can be certain that things that are being pushed out right now as the solution to dealing with COVID in the healthcare sector has actually been researched and has the data to back it up. The other thing that I want to think about as well is, let's think innovation, Currently on the continent, there's about 375 pharmaceutical companies. That's compared to 5,000 in China and about 10,000 in India. So we obviously have opportunities when it comes to the healthcare sector to create new companies. We have a lot of human capacity throughout the continent, as well as in the diaspora. I'd love to see more collaboration in terms of bringing some of this expertise back home to help foster new companies and create new solutions in the healthcare sector. The other thing that I would like to address is looking for potential investors. Now, a lot of, obviously there's 54 countries on the continent, and all of us all have our different policies in terms of investment and what is required to be able to invest in our countries. I think this is a good time for government to review some of the policies that act more as a barrier, and to try and make things as easy as possible for us to be able to attract funding, especially for small businesses and financing. I worked on a project about a year and a half ago. I actually did it with my Nigerian counterpart, Mr. Audu Makori, and this was in regards to an energy project in the DRC. And I know we got so far until we got to the government issuing a sovereign guarantee, which we found out then they would not issue the sovereign guarantee, and we had a set project already good to go. And so governments can actually look at the policies that they have in place right now and how that can actually help facilitate engineers that are on the continent looking to solve issues such as the energy problems right now. In summary, I just want to say we need to come together. We need to applaud the efforts that have already been done by the government. Let's not, again, I'm not going to take this opportunity to bash the governments as to what they're doing wrong. I do want to say I've been very happy to see the president of Madagascar with his cure. He has tried something. They have made an effort in producing something. We need to take the second step, which is making sure that the clinical trials and the data behind it is actually sound. And as well as the Institut Pasteur in Senegal, who have created a cost-effective testing kit for $1, which is affordable by the masses. It's not something that that is going to be unaffordable for the majority. I think it's helped them in how they've been managing this outbreak, as well as $60 ventilators. Imagine being able to produce ventilators at such an affordable price, and we don't have to wait for other countries to send us their ventilators. We can actually produce in-house, and so that's another great idea for small businesses to look at and explore. I think I've pretty much covered what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes, you have. Thank you so much, Nicolette from DRC Congo. At this point, our time is quickly running past, and we have to take questions and we have to take comments from the audience. But I want to give Amara an opportunity to just make some remarks about a mindset shift, because we have a lot of African leaders who maybe go into politics for the wrong reasons, and they get there and they're not thinking about the greater good, but most times they're thinking about their selfish interests. So how can we produce better leaders on the continent? Because I think leadership is a huge problem that we have on the continent. We don't have enough visionary leaders who, want to think for themselves, want to innovate, as opposed to having that copy and paste approach, which we call isomorphic mimicry, where you just look at what is happening in another country and then just do the same thing in your own country. So what do you think, what do you think can be done to cause the mindset shift in the quality of leadership that we have on the continent? And how can we, improve on advocacy to get the right policies out there so that they can be implemented? Amara, we can't hear you. I don't know if others can hear you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Okay. So just become ready with your questions. Participants, we'll give an opportunity for some people to ask questions live. So if you want to ask a question, just indicate by raising your hand. So we'll just split it between. Amara, yeah, I think it's a bit better, but you have to project your voice.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just say very quickly that the leadership problem in Africa is one side of the coin.
You have to speak a little louder, please. Sorry. Okay, you can.
Yeah. Okay, so leadership problem in Africa is one side of the coin. The followership problem is another side of that coin.
Okay, Amara, we're having technical issues. I don't know, other panelists, can you hear? If you can hear him, can you wave?
I can hear him.
Oh, okay. So go ahead then.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ed, for hearing me.
You're welcome.
All the way from Ithaca, New York. I'm just saying that the leadership and the followership problem in Africa are two sides of the same coin. You know, we've got the same problem, but with leadership and followership. And I think that the key is for us to continue to have these conversations. I think one of the things that this COVID pandemic period has taught me is just how hard it is to engineer behavioral change in Africa, especially in Nigeria, down to the grassroots levels, because I've been part of a presidential committee here in Nigeria that's been trying to drive behavioral change in terms of personal hygiene and social distancing. I'll just say that it's important for us to continue to make the investments in collaborating with civil society, collaborating with government, collaborating with private sector, to continue to drive these kinds of conversations, to get people to contribute to conversations like this in Africa, not just at the grassroots level, but at the, not just at the grassroots level, but at the you know, at every level of government, on social media as well. We need to continue to have these conversations. We have to have these conversations consistently. If we have these conversations consistently, then we stand a chance of reorienting people's minds. You can't, you know, get good leaders out of bad followers. Eventually, followers become leaders. So you must continue to orient the mind of people continuously until a point where you build a critical mass of individuals, of people who actually have their you know, their heads screwed on right, their minds in the right places, and they have the right orientation. Then from that pool, you can recruit leaders. So it's not something that's going to be immediate, but it's something that we need to continue to work towards. And I think this is the reason why we are having this kinds of conversation, is to bring together people of like minds, capable young Africans, both at home and in diaspora, who can continue to have these conversations, build their own capacity, draw in others, build the capacity of their friends, you know, and people around their networks. And then we can build a critical mass of people from whom we can recruit the kinds of leaders that we need. Thank you.
Okay, so apologies for those who couldn't hear. I think some of the people in the comment section complained about that, but and I couldn't really hear as well, but I'm sure that your remarks were on point and addressed the question. So we'll go right to the participants. We still have over 100 participants with us. We'll give an opportunity to some people to ask live, but now I'm just going to read out some questions, and you know, any panelists can take it up, except it's addressed to one person in particular. So someone asked, Oladipo Alunge asked, you mentioned that Nigerian states will have reduced revenues. What policies can be implemented to encourage states to look inwards and generate more revenues instead of relying more on federal allocation? I would also want to add to that question about federal allocation. How do we get people on the countries on the continent to become more self-reliant as opposed to, you know, depending on aid from the Western world? How do we get, you know, more innovative ways of, you know, financing our governments and our states? I think we can ask Dr. Obi that question because, you know, it has to do with state governments.
I think that specific to Nigeria, there's always been an interest on the part of Nigerians on what goes on in Abuja. people pay less attention to what goes on at the states, at the level of the states, right? So there's no scrutiny of those who lead state governments. And so they just get a free lunch. I think it's time for more attention to be given to the poor performance that we see across the states of the country. I think probably less than maybe 5 out of that, maybe I'm even exaggerating that number, 5 out of the 36 states in the country, including Abuja, are places that you can say have any material or significant level of internally generated revenue. And so if the indigents of a state and residents of a state are comfortable with a governor who simply is in office to distribute rent from oil that he gets a share of every quarter that they come to Abuja to collect it, then that's going to be the norm. And that's what we normalized. But if the indigents, if the people of a state say, we have had enough of this low level performance, this low energy in actually generating production and productivity activities that would lead to the state being self-sufficient in revenue and using whatever comes from the center as a buffer, then it would change, because then they would go for the quality of people that would give them that kind of economic leadership in the management of their states, right? So it goes back again to what are citizens expecting? Are citizens at the state level expecting good economic performance, or are they comfortable to let people ride roughshod over them and be distributors of oil money? And then at the level of countries across the continent, are citizens of countries across the continent finally ready to get out of the bottom? Are we prepared to challenge the quality of economic thought that that has taken us to the place where we're celebrated poor continent of the world? That's it. Ultimately, it's got to be that citizens say enough is enough. We have no reason as a continent that has produced reasonable amount of economic minds, credible minds in technology, in the sciences, in all fields of learning, to be governed by jokers. If the day the continent citizens say, it's done, we want a new normal. This is the era of new normal, right? Our new normal is that there is a certain level of economic mindset that we need in our governance. The citizens would make it happen. That's what democracy is all about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi. Just to reiterate, she says the citizens will make it happen. So we all have a role to play. Let's not just look to government alone. I have another question from the audience, and this one has to do with debt relief. So I'm going to have Edward Mabaya answer this question, and any other person who wants to join in. And the person says, do you think African countries demanding debt relief, do you think African countries demanding debt relief because of COVID is born of entitlement? Why and why not? So Ed, you work in a bank, obviously you give loans to people and you expect them to pay back. Is there a case for debt relief? I'm sorry, you're muted. Sorry, 1 second. I'm trying to
Ed, you're on mute.
Oh, I was on mute, huh? Okay. I think I have, people have personal positions on this, and right now I'm speaking on behalf of the bank. We are a bank, a development bank, and loans are given out to countries on the conditions that they're expected to repay them. Different countries have different arrangements with different borrowers, so I cannot speak on their behalf, so I'll just leave it at that. But I just want to say, since I have the opportunity to address the audience, I do like very much that sentiment that here's a pandemic that has created, in some cases, troubling challenges, but in some cases, it's making us wake up to situations. Like I said before, you find a crisis and you don't let a crisis go to waste. it highlights certain challenges that we've been speaking about for decades of years before. This is a moment where we have the attention of policymakers and decision makers to underscore the same very key messages that we've been, you need to get your productivity in agriculture right, you need to invest in health, you need to invest in education. These key fundamentals have not changed. And I just want to say, while I have the platform, to emphasize again that yes, COVID is a new crisis, but the fundamental solutions that are required to develop the African continents remain very much the same. We just need to double down on those solutions and capitalize on this opportunity to encourage our leaders to put priorities in the right place.
Thank you so much for that response. There's another question here, which is quite interesting. The person says, how can we get our people to rally behind the idea of one Africa? A concept I believe is very key to revolutionizing the planet. Just to add to that question, how can we encourage collaboration amongst African countries? Like I keep saying, I always meet Africans, in America or in Europe. I hardly meet Africans on the continent. How do we encourage, collaborations among, businesses, amongst governments? How can we be a united Africa in our response to COVID-19? Kim, you can answer that question.
Yes. So I think we just have to really have more opportunities to actually speak, and talk and have conversations. And there was actually a conference called Africa NXT, which was a Pan-African conference that really talked about different subjects from technology to agriculture, and looked for Pan-African solutions. So I think these type of dialogues have to happen more often. I think that we need to also be very intentional about networking and about building networks. And, I'm one of the 2019 Obama Africa leaders, and we're a cohort of 200 African leaders from 45 African countries. So I have friends all over Africa, and it's, the most amazing thing, because when we chat in our group, there are, we exchange ideas. Even with this, pandemic, we were sending each other solutions in our countries to see how can we, implement them in our own. We were, sort of fundraising for each other, and there were a lot of amazing, the Obama Foundation also organized a lot of amazing panel discussions that were focused on the continent and what we can do on the continent. So I think that this should not be an effort that is, obviously I really commend President Obama for this initiative, and for raising African leaders. But I think that we have to be more intentional on the continent, right? And we have to foster collaboration. The problem is that, when you don't know each other, you don't realize how much you have in common. And you don't realize the humanity and the problems that are truly African problems that you share. Right? It is when you talk to people that, you don't even know what their country looks like, and they tell you and they show you pictures, and, you're like, this is like Lagos. Then you realize that we have more in common than, what sort of separates us and puts us apart. And I think we need to overcome, issues like xenophobia, where we, hate each other and where we fight each other. I think we really have to work on unity, and that can only happen by connecting, intermingling, and having conversations. And I think that technology is the perfect platform to do that. The conference that I was talking about, the Africa NXT, was a conference that was hosted on a technology platform. And it was a truly amazing experience to just connect with people from all over the continent that have the same sort of thinking and the same agenda and want to move the continent forward. And it is, whenever I am in these networks or, conferences and network where I meet other young leaders, old leaders that are just, really invested in Africa. And we all have, the same shared, sort of, vision, and we all want a better Africa, and we're all ready to work for it, and we're all ready to invest in it. And I think that we just need to become a critical mass.
Thank you so much. Edward, you can add to.
I just want to add on a lighter level here that I think the African continent today is more united than any other time in history. Look, if you're on WhatsApp, you know a joke happens in Nigeria, it's in Zimbabwe the next day. So we are united more than any time before. If you look at the music industry, you see this collaboration taking place. What we just need to do is make sure that it's being harnessed towards the right platforms. Just 2 weeks ago, as part of a meeting with 45 heads of ministers of agriculture, approaching how do we deal with this COVID pandemic. 45 ministers of agriculture in one place. It cost nothing because it was on a Zoom platform just like this. Previously, you would have had many flights and jets coming from all over the world. We are more united now than any other time before. So I think we should correct that misconception that Africa is divided. Thanks to digital technologies, the continent of Africa now and the African diaspora is connected more than at any other point in history. So we should keep that in mind and harness that power.
Thank you so much. I'm going to allow someone from the audience ask a question. And Musa Raji, you can ask your question now.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, all right, fantastic. My problem, kudos to all the panelists. And I really appreciate what, I think his name is Amara. I'm so sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly. What you mentioned about not having good leaders, we cannot have good leaders if we are a bad people, you know. But my particular question now is, and I know that this cannot be answered in black or white, the answer is not set in stone, but how do you deal with vested interests? Because I know that has been a problem, a challenge with development in a lot of African states. By the way, I'm Nigerian, but I'm currently in United Kingdom, but I understand a lot about how this plays out in Nigeria, because I lived in Nigeria for almost all my life.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take another question from the audience so that we can just answer like 3 questions at once, because we have limited time. We're hoping to wrap up in the next few minutes. So I'm going to let Nathaniel Ojobo ask a question. Nathaniel is actually a member of the FEMA advisory team. So please keep your questions 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is specifically directed to Dr. Obi Ezekwesili. And so I am particular about the comments that have been made by a lot of people faulting the lockdown affected by many African countries. A lot of people have touted it as a knee-jerk approach, similar to what happened in Europe. European countries locked down most of their economies in order to tackle COVID-19. And we didn't look at the peculiarity of our situation to do that. And I am one of those who have also faulted this. I want to get your perspective on that. Do you agree that the lockdowns that have been affected by virtually all the African countries that have been invaded by COVID-19 is not correct? And if you think so, what do you think is the...
Okay, thank you, Nathaniel.
Best, considering that even in the pandemic, somehow the economy must, go on. So that's my question.
Thank you for that brilliant question. So just hold on 1 second. Let's take one more question so that we can answer that one. Ismail Haruna.
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate all the panelists. I would want to ask, and my question would actually go to the FDB and those in the public sector that are part of the panelists. I heard one of the panelists saying the COVID has taught them a lesson as regards trying to actually deploy and cover up this infrastructure gap. But I can't see the action. I can't see the remorse. It doesn't seem as if the rethink is there. So I would want to ask, the health infrastructure has a huge gap. The school, the universities and the tertiary institutions, even the secondary, the primary, they are on a still as you speak. Nothing is going on. Likewise, so I would want to ask, if technology has been deployed, if all these infrastructures have been in place, the country will not be on a lockdown, most especially the African countries, because the health infrastructure is on lockdown, the educational system is on lockdown. Even public sector themselves cannot work, because if they don't go to the office, they can't do anything because they still carry paper around. So if they really feel remorseful about this COVID, I feel now is the time for them to start the deployment of cloud technologies, digital transformation, and automating all the process end to end. Thank you.
So, thank you.
I don't know if I can quickly come in here just before Dr. Obi goes on.
Okay.
There are just some things I want to highlight here. So I think as regards the lockdown, it's a dicey situation that a lot of leadership was put in. It was almost a question of what is the greater evil. If you look at all the experts, and they've spoken about how you need to lock down, you need to maintain some social distance measures in order to flatten this infection curve. The reason for flattening the infection curve is so that this healthcare system, no matter how advanced they are, they can be overwhelmed. So you have to be able to put measures in place that don't overwhelm your healthcare system. So you could say it's a knee-jerk reaction to lockdown. I remember having a conversation with my friend when Italy locked down their country, and he said it was an archaic and draconian measure. But guess what? If we can have data that shows that if we hadn't locked down, there would be so and so consequences. Hence why a lot of countries now, in reaction to this, what they have done is gradually ease these restrictions, because they understand that there's also an issue of hunger. So if you stay indoors, you don't have any means of livelihood, there could be a problem there with hunger. But you have to understand it's a peculiar one for leaders, where they have to think hunger, infection, which is the greater evil, which is more certain, and then take measures that are in line with that.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Obi.
Yeah, so I think that the first question was the question from the gentleman. I am trying to remember the question the gentleman from the United Kingdom had asked. I'm sorry, I didn't take note of that question.
Asked about vested interests.
Vested interests. Yes, I knew that it was something like that. Okay, so this is really about. He's asking a question essentially about the quality of the politics and the institutions of governance on our continent, and that question goes to the heart of how is it that our democratic maturation has not gotten to the place where we have institutional mechanisms to prevent the kind of state capture that we see happen across the continent. And that question goes to what we said. My last point was the power of citizens to design a different continent. In the governance of countries, we can apply the concepts of the market, where we say that every product has a supply side and a demand side. Right? So in governance, if you looked at it as a product, has a demand side and a supply side. Unfortunately, on our continent, the supply side, is booming, but the demand side is asleep. And because the demand side is asleep, the booming supply side acts like a monopolist. A monopolist has no incentive to give you quality product or cost effectiveness. The monopolist is a price giver, not a price taker. So what we see is that those who lead the continent with, lead going like this, spend a lot of their energy doing things that subvert the common good, because the demand side being the citizens who should set the standard of quality of governance that they believe they are entitled to, are sleeping on the wheel. Until we fix that, it is going to be very hard for people who already govern badly with no consequences, with no form of a measure that checks their impunity from doing so. So that's the way to answer it. But in places where you have fairly reasonable leadership at the top level, what they try to do is to put in place systems that prevent state captured, systems that prevent corruption. When you reduce opportunities for corruption, then less corruption happens. And then they put in place systems of deterrent so that when people, in spite of all that the preventive measures you've taken, engage in corruption, they will definitely know that there will be consequence for their action. So those things work together with a top leadership that models the behavior of ethical environment, ethical society, to create a different, environment or a different climate that does not tolerate the kind of phenomena that we see on the continent of corruption, of abuse of office, of all kinds of, personal aggrandizement and things like that. Now, on the question of should we have locked down or should we not have? I think it's a pretty tough question for all policy makers and political leaders. But at the end of the day, when you are in a catch-22 situation, you have to sort of look at, what is it that gives you, what is your less dangerous outcome, right? So in the case of a tension between life and livelihood, life and livelihood, that's what we're dealing with. Just allow everybody to carry on as normal, as though nothing were going on, as though a viral infection, a deadly one, was not out on the streets, or so that they can just keep doing business? Or should we tell people to just give a little bit of a break from the gathering together, since the health experts say to us that the more interaction that happens, the viral spread goes not just geometrically in increase, but exponentially in increase, and data is there to prove it. When you're faced with the tension between these two, you have to pray to have a war chest. The problem with Africa is that we didn't have a war chest before this war began. And so the things that we needed to do in order to buy the compliance with our lockdown, we're not, we didn't have it. We didn't have the fiscal space to be able to do it. That does not suggest that it would have been wrong for us to actually take those health measures that the scientists have proven do work. So this tension also exacerbated because we did not also invest in the top leadership of our continent, preparing the citizens for the kind of sensitization on the issues involved. And so the societies were hardly mobilized to see this as a problem that could take down everybody, not just the rich. So if you're faced with this situation, I see clearly that it's tough, but I did say to Professor Soludo, for example, that I do not think that this idea of an Africa exceptionalism is a good topic on this matter of tension between life and livelihood. We could have designed a way of alleviating the pains of staying away for a while until the plague would pass over our continent. If we found a way for political leaders to organize our society better, do you know that a lot of interventions that have gone on to support families in need did not come from government in many of the African countries, including ours? A lot of augmentation of these necessities have come from social organizations, individuals, families, and the private sector. So I think that this debate should not get academic and we us trying to prove an Africa exceptionalism to a universal principle of the science of how viral infections spread, especially when they are as deadly as the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi. So we have a hard stop at 7. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent, all the panelists, all the participants. We're going to just allow 2 more questions, and as the panelists take the questions, you just give your closing remarks. So 2 questions from the audience. Please keep your questions to 10 seconds so that we can quickly wrap up. So, Poladi, you can go next.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Dr. Obi mentioned that one of the ways we can, she mentioned actually that one of the largest employer of labor in Africa is the small and medium scale businesses. How can we boost this sector of the economy?
There are many things that you have to do. There's no silver bullet, but you can improve the environment in which they do business. And so some of the things that have worked are to create clusters around their activities. If you understand and you diagnose their common needs, you can create clusters where critical infrastructure that they need to have a low cost environment to do the things that they do would be available to them. So the issue of energy, the issue of water, access to water, the issue of even attracting the right kinds of talent in one pool around the same kind of clustered environment, those kinds of things boost their productivity. What you need is for those kinds of businesses to be able to have low cost, then it enhances their revenue part and then creates a pathway towards scale for them. And then because they are also clustered, they find opportunities to collaborate. And then you would see businesses grow both in terms of spread as well as in terms of reach and depth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi. So last question, Andrea and who BJ, quickly, 30 seconds so that we can give our closing remarks. Andrea. Andrea, can you hear us? Andrea, are you there? Okay, who BJ? You said.
Sorry, is it myself?
Okay, you can go ahead. Yes, please, 10 seconds for your question.
Okay. Thank you very much. So my question is this: we've spoken a lot on that public-private partnership has to do with moving the continent forward. So my question is this: what do you think would be the role of multinationals, or the role that multinationals can actually play in improving the competitiveness and the productivity that we've spoken about that the continent so desperately needs?
Okay, thank you. Andrea, you can go ahead with your question.
Hi, my question was to the panelists. It was just in regards to China's influence over Africa currently. Some of the loans that have been put to African countries, which have meant basically they've not been able to go and repay some of those loans, have led to China owning some of the infrastructure, some of the public infrastructure within those countries. What were the panelists' thoughts on that? It's been said that it's kind of tantamount to recolonization of African countries. I just wanted to see what their views were.
All right, so the panelists can answer that question so that we can have our closing remarks.
I'll answer the first question about the role of multinationals, and just say here that Africa is big. There's space for everybody here. We cannot fall into this false narrative that is one or the other. I really think that there's some role that multinationals can play, so too can small businesses and other organizations. We have to have all hands on deck, including the big organizations where it sees fit. We just need to have proper regulations in the countries that hold all companies and all players to account, and that's all, the enabling environment that we're talking about.
Thank you, everyone.
I can take the second question regarding China and the loans that we take from there. I think there just needs to be responsibility practiced all around in terms of how we ourselves are borrowing the monies. We need to understand this isn't money that we're just going to use and never have to pay back. These are things we need to factor in as of at the time we're taking these loans. We need to be accountable that the monies used for these loans are going into what they're supposed to be going into, because eventually when we hand down, I feel like the next generation is going to inherit economies full of debt and not actually be able to come out on the other side. I mean, again, it's going to be tantamount to recolonization. But the onus is on us as Africans as well to be responsible about the way that we are carrying ourselves as it relates to getting these loans. And I think Dr. Obi made a case as well in her article during this current times of what may be, what might be used as some solutions to help solve some of the problems we're going to get because of whatever has been mismanaged by certain governments. So I think that's it. There's two parts to play: holding others accountable, but holding ourselves accountable as well. And I'm going to give my closing remarks. Just thank you to everyone again, all the participants, the panelists, Dr. Obi. It's been such a privilege to hear you speak today. Chinaya, you've done an excellent job. Thank you for bringing us all here together. Want to just leave a note on African unity. We really have to care about one another, guys. It takes being united. Literally means that understanding that my interests are your interests and your interests are my interests. So and you know, and acting accordingly as well. Not just saying that, but also acting accordingly. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if I can go on after you, Nicolette. I think what you have said is very poignant about responsibility on both sides. I think African governments have the responsibility to borrow prudently. There should be some form of fiscal responsibility, as well as lenders need to understand that when they're structuring this debt for African economies, they should not be opportunistic. I also wanted to just touch on a previous point about SMEs. I think that in Nigeria, for instance, SMEs provide about contribution of 47% to GDP, and I think it's about 70% of the labor force. I think that majority of what SMEs need, which is actually, there's a presidential council called the PEBEC that is actually tasked with providing that enabling environment, is I think that definitely access to finance is key, and removing the administrative bottlenecks and constraints. So what we have found with businesses is that some of the issues that they have are as a result of maybe bribery, some organizations or departments standing in the way of their growth for rent seeking, for instance. So I think that if we can enable some of these constraints and bottlenecks, it'll be good. I think final comment, I'm very grateful to be in the midst of all the panelists, Dr. Obi, Amara, Nicolette, and Kem Delem, Ed, everybody. And I think that more conversations like this should be fostered. So in order to promote inter-African unity.
My parting shots.
Go ahead, George.
Two parting shots. Thank you very much for the wonderful opportunity. Two key messages. One is we shall overcome. Africa has been through a lot, probably more pandemics in Africa than anywhere else in the world. So we have to look for a brighter future, or this will come to pass one day. The second point is agriculture matters. We have to focus on where Africa has competitive advantage. We have to feed Africa from African land. We have to focus on agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Closing remarks, and Kimberly.
Yes, thank you very much. So my closing remarks are that, you know, technology has to become our key strategic economic development driver. And I think that there are three other things that sort of have to happen across the continent, you know, in order for us to actually build a stronger continent. And that the first thing is collaboration. If we don't collaborate, we're not actually going to see actual results. The second thing is knowledge exchange. There's so much knowledge across the continent where we can actually learn from each other, and even within our countries, where one state has done something successfully and the other state is yet to implement it. Yet they go on and figure out it by themselves instead of actually learning from use cases and case studies. And so I think we need to document and we need to share the knowledge that we learn. And, as Somkele also said, we need to make data-driven decisions, and I think that is also really a big part of that knowledge exchange. And the last thing that, we have to ensure is that young people have to get involved in policy discussions like these. If we don't, sort of raise our voices, the policy discussions will be had by people who, don't really understand the new world order, and who are unfortunately also not going to be here in the next 20, 30 years, right? But we have to live with whatever decisions are being made on our behalf. So we must get involved, and that means that we have to sacrifice. It means that it's extra work. It means that we have to read. It means that we have to gain knowledge. It means that we have to connect with the generation that has gone before us, right? To also get their knowledge, because a lot of the policies, a lot of the knowledge, especially the institutional knowledge within countries and economies, is in the heads of people. It is not documented. So it's not a case of, I'll go on the internet and search. No, you must connect. You have to have intergenerational dialogue in order for young people to actually become actively engaged and also really understand what is the history of where we are today. Because without understanding our history, we will not be able to plot the path for our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nkem. I think the comments from the comment section have been amazing. Everyone is loving it. So we're just going to have Amara, and then we'll close with Dr. Obi Ezekwesili with our closing remarks. So Amara, go ahead quickly. Thank you. Amara, we can't hear you. So,
okay. To be honest, I don't know if you can.
It's better now. Better.
But I don't have much to say. I'm just very happy to be part of this conversation. I totally enjoyed it. It was very interesting, and I hope that we'd have more sessions like this in the future. And I look forward to Dr. Obi's closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amara. And then last but not the least, Dr. Obi Ezekwesili, thank you so much for being here. Your closing remarks, please.
So I think, well done to all of you for organizing this. Do some more, get many more intergenerational dialogue, like Nkem Dilim said. It's really powerful to be able to do this with you. Number two is the post-COVID global economy is going to reorganize itself. And the reorganization is going to be deliberate on the part of some countries. Is Africa going to be deliberate? That's the big question. And one thing that I know will happen is that the production system of the world is going to be regraphed or redrafted. And Africa stands an opportunity to be a welcome environment for the investment that would move out from certain regions and be looking for home. The continent will be well represented if many more countries would actually get the governments investing in the pro-business kind of reforms that would make investment attracted to open up shops in the countries of the continent. The third thing is that this technology wave, digital economy, is going to go from about 7 to 11, depending on what you're counting, of GDP, of global GDP, to something in the neighborhood of 25% within the next decade. That means that Africa could just be completely down under if it does not use the opportunity that COVID has given to throw the window really, or the door wide open for the necessary investment in backbone infrastructure, both at the urban level and cities, as well as at the rural level, to integrate them into the global economy. It's important for technology policy to completely really change, overhaul it, And if I had the opportunity, I would simply give it to the young people who are making things happen despite the rigidities of policy to just draft what they want to see done. And I know that as innovators, they would really get it done. And then the final thing is, you see, those of you who are part of this conversation, you represent the segment of Africa's young people that should be leading the continent. But unfortunately, you all think that the really cool thing is to be a company owner and then be struggling to say, why are the right policies not being made? Come on, guys, get real. The right policies will not be made until the right kind of thinking is in the political system and structure. And you have not been willing to make the necessary sacrifice to be leaders in the process of political change and political transformation of the continent. We must fix politics. It falls on your generation to fix politics on our continent. The politics that we have is hideous. It is too self-serving. It is too lowering of standards, and it bottoms the continent. You must take the continent on a race to the top by being interested in the quality of political thought that leads to great economic performance. It is your job. It is actually the purpose for which you've been born. I wish you all well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi Ezekwesili. You've been simply amazing. Thank you for your time. Thank you for staying till the end of the panel. Thank you to each and everyone who joined us, all the participants who have been leaving exciting comments for everybody. And this has been amazing. Please follow us on our social media handles so that when we curate other webinars, you'll be in the loop. I've had a great time. I've learned so much, and I'm so inspired. I believe that the future of Africa is bright and that we're going to get it right. So on this note, thank you, Nkemdilim. Thank you, Amara. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Nicolette. Thank you, Somkele. Thank you to everybody who joined. This has been exciting. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.